On the 14th of October in the year 1814, exactly 3 weeks since she had turned 26 and officially crossed into the territory that society deemed hopeless, Eleanor Ashworth stood in her sister Clara's drawing room, wearing her dove-grey dress and wondering if anyone in the entire county would notice if she simply faded into the wallpaper. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows with that particular golden quality that only autumn could produce, casting long shadows across the oriental carpet and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits too insignificant to matter, much like Eleanor herself. Clara's gathering was in full force around her, a flurry of silk and gossip and tinkling laughter that seemed to exist in a world adjacent to Eleanor's own, close enough to observe but impossible to truly enter. She had positioned herself near the window seat, half hidden by the heavy damask curtains, watching the leaves turn gold and crimson on the oak trees that lined the Pemberton property, while the conversation of the assembled ladies washed over her like water over river stones. Her father's cough had been particularly troublesome this morning, rattling through the quiet halls of their modest home with a persistence that worried her more than she allowed herself to admit, and she had almost used his health as an excuse to decline Clara's invitation. But duty had dragged her here as it always did, duty and the knowledge that her absence would only fuel the whispers rather than silence them. Clara, 8 months heavy with her second child, and radiant with the particular smugness of a woman who had done everything right according to society's exacting standards, caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and smiled that smile that was not quite warm, not quite cold, merely the acknowledgement that yes, her spinster sister was present, occupying space, as unremarkable as the furniture. It was then that Eleanor heard it, the whisper that cut through the pleasant hum of conversation like a blade through silk. Mrs. Pemberton murmuring to Lady Carstairs about poor Eleanor. 26 now and plain as ever. Such a disappointment when Clara turned out so well. And did you know the Viscount Sinclair has taken Thornbury Hall for the season? They say he is wealthy beyond imagination, but cold, so very cold, his heart frozen since that tragedy with his fiancée. And he shall be at tomorrow's assembly. Every eligible lady in the county will be there hoping to thaw him. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment, but with the weary recognition of her own invisibility. For even in discussing eligibility and assemblies and viscounts worth pursuing, no one thought to glance her way or consider her a contender in any game worth playing. She pressed her palm against the cool window glass and watched a single leaf detach from its branch and spiral downward, beautiful in its descent, and she thought that perhaps there was dignity in accepting what one was rather than yearning for what one could never become. And yet somewhere beneath her practiced resignation, something stirred at the mention of tomorrow, of music, of a room full of possibility, however unlikely any of that possibility might include her. The assembly rooms on the evening of October 15th, 1814, blazed with the light of 100 candles, their flames reflected in the tall mirrors that lined the walls and multiplied until the space seemed infinite, a glittering universe of silk and satin and the desperate aspirations of every marriageable woman in the county. And Eleanor Ashworth pressed herself against the wall near a spray of hothouse roses, their crimson petals heavy with fragrance, and wished herself anywhere but here, in her father's quiet study perhaps, or walking the autumn lanes where no one expected her to smile or make pleasant conversation or pretend she did not notice the pitying glances that slid over her like water over stone. She wore the dove-grey dress again, because she had nothing else suitable, and because it hardly mattered what she wore when no one truly looked at her anyway, and she watched the couples forming for the first dance with that familiar ache that she had long since learned to push down into the deepest chambers of her heart where it could not embarrass her. Clara had arrived on her husband's arm, despite being 8 months gone with child, radiant in pale blue silk, and Eleanor had watched her sister introduce Mr. Pemberton to various notables, had watched Clara's eyes sweep past her as though she were merely another piece of furniture, unremarkable and fixed in place. It was then that he entered, and the room seemed to shift on its axis, conversation stuttering and resuming with a new electricity that Eleanor felt even from her obscured position among the roses. Viscount Sinclair was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark blue coat so impeccably tailored it seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, and his face held an expression of such complete disinterest that Eleanor found herself almost admiring his ability to seem bored by the very attention everyone else in the room craved. She watched the young ladies flutter toward him like moths to flame, watched Clara maneuver Mr. Pemberton into position for an introduction, watched the Viscount respond with perfectly correct coldness to each simpering greeting, and she felt something strange stir in her chest. Not attraction precisely, but recognition, the sense of seeing someone else who stood apart from the swirling mass of social ambition, alone even while surrounded. He was dancing now with Miss Harrington, the acknowledged beauty of the county, and Eleanor observed how his hand held hers at precisely the correct distance, how his expression never warmed despite Miss Harrington's obvious efforts to charm, and she thought that perhaps there were worse things than being invisible, perhaps being seen and found. Wanting was its own particular torment. She turned to study the roses instead, counting their petals, breathing their sweetness, and that was when she felt it, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck, and she looked up to find the Viscount's eyes upon her across the crowded room, dark and steady and utterly unreadable, meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat before she looked quickly away, her heart beating far too fast for a woman who had long ago abandoned hope. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The candles had burned low in their sconces, their flames guttering and casting dancing shadows across the assembly room walls, when Eleanor felt, rather than saw, someone approaching her position among the roses, and her first thought was that Clara had sent someone to fetch her, to tell her it was time to leave, to spare the family further embarrassment of her wallflower presence. But when she turned her head, she found herself looking up into the face of Viscount Sinclair himself, his dark eyes regarding her with an expression she could not decipher, something between curiosity and challenge, and for a moment she simply stared at him like a creature startled in the woods, unable to comprehend why this man, who had been the object of every ambitious glance in the room, should be standing before her, before the plainest and most insignificant woman present. "I believe you have been hiding, Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was lower than she had expected, rougher at the edges, and she wondered how he knew her name when Clara had so carefully avoided introducing them, and she wondered too if this was some sort of elaborate jest, if Miss Harrington and the other young ladies were watching from across the room and laughing at whatever game was being played at her expense. "I have not been hiding, my lord," she replied, surprised to find her voice steady when her heart was racing so terribly, merely standing where I am least likely to obstruct the view of those who wish to be seen. He tilted his head slightly at that, something flickering in those dark eyes that might have been amusement or might have been approval, and he said that he had noticed her specifically because she was not attempting to be noticed, that in a room full of peacocks displaying their plumage, a woman content to observe the roses was refreshingly unusual. The musicians struck up a country dance, and before Eleanor could formulate a response that would politely end this bewildering encounter, he extended his hand toward her with a formality that brooked no refusal. "You will dance with me, Miss Ashworth," he said, and it was not a question, and she found herself placing her gloved hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm even through the layers of fabric between them, and allowing him to lead her toward the forming lines of dancers, while whispers erupted around them like startled birds taking flight. She heard Clara's sharp intake of breath, heard Mrs. Pemberton's astonished murmur to Lady Carstairs, heard the rustle of fans being raised to hide moving lips. But Frederick Sinclair seemed utterly indifferent to the sensation they were causing, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and, strangely, seen in a way she had never been seen before. "You do not simper," he observed as they moved through the figures of the dance. "And you have not once complimented my coat or inquired about my estate, or mentioned how fatiguing the journey from London must have been. "I have nothing fashionable to say, my lord," Eleanor replied, "and if you sought stimulating conversation, I fear you chose your partner poorly." "On the contrary," he said as his hand found hers again, warm and steady and startlingly present. "I believe I may have chosen very well indeed." And when the dance ended and he released her with a bow that lingered a breath too long, his eyes held hers with a look that promised this was not an ending, but a beginning. And Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something she had sealed away so carefully, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. The morning of October the 16th, 1814, arrived grey and heavy with the promise of rain, and Eleanor stood at her father's bedside in the cramped study that had become his sick room these past months, watching him struggle through another fit of coughing that left him pale and trembling against his pillows, and she thought how strange it was that her body could be here, performing the familiar rituals of care, adjusting blankets and measuring out the tincture Dr. Whitmore had prescribed, while her mind remained stubbornly fixed on a pair of dark eyes and a warm hand and words that surely meant nothing, that could not possibly mean anything, because men like Viscount Sinclair did not dance with women like Eleanor Ashworth, except as curiosities, as momentary diversions from the tedium of country assemblies. "You are distracted this morning," her father observed when the coughing had subsided, his voice thin, but his eyes sharp as they had always been, missing nothing. And Eleanor felt the heat rise to her cheeks as she busied herself with the medicine bottles crowding his desk, the volumes of poetry and philosophy he could no longer hold steady enough to read. "I am merely tired, Papa," she replied, but he made a sound that might have been a laugh if his lungs had allowed it, and he reached for her hand with fingers that felt like paper over bone. "Your mother used to look just so when she was keeping something from me," he said. And Eleanor felt the familiar ache at the mention of her mother, dead these 20 years in the birthing bed, leaving behind a husband who never recovered, and 2 daughters who had learned very different lessons from her absence. She was settling into the chair beside him, prepared to read aloud from the volume of Cowper he favoured, when the sound of a carriage on the lane made them both turn toward the window, and Eleanor's heart seized in her chest as she recognized her sister's elegant barouche, Clara arriving unannounced and certainly uninvited, her curiosity too pressing to wait for propriety. The interrogation began before Clara had even removed her gloves, her pregnant belly preceding her into the study like an accusation, her eyes bright with a hunger for scandal that Eleanor had learned to dread. "The whole county is talking," Clara announced, settling herself into the only comfortable chair and leaving Eleanor to stand. "And I must say, I never thought you capable of such boldness, throwing yourself at the Viscount like some desperate fortune hunter, though I suppose at your age one cannot afford to be particular." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, but Clara swept on, her voice dropping to the delicious whisper she reserved for the choicest gossip. "Did you know he was engaged once, years ago, to a girl named Amelia Harcourt? Beautiful and accomplished and everything you are not, and she died of a fever 3 weeks before the wedding, and they say he has never recovered, that he swore never to marry. So whatever you imagine happened last night, I assure you it was nothing but pity or perhaps amusement at the novelty of dancing with a plain spinster who could pose no threat to his resolve." The words landed like blows, but Eleanor kept her face still, her hands folded, until Clara delivered her final revelation with poorly concealed triumph. "And anyway you should know that he called at our house this morning, asking after you most particularly, asking where you might be found. And I told him nothing, of course, because I will not have my sister making a spectacle of herself. And with that, she swept out as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving Eleanor standing in the grey morning light with her father's knowing eyes upon her, and something trembling in her chest that felt like the first green shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. The rain had not ceased for 2 days when the knock came at the door of the Ashworth cottage on the afternoon of October 18th, 1814, and Eleanor, who had been reading aloud to her father from a volume of Wordsworth while the grey light seeped through windows that needed cleaning, and the fire struggled against the damp chill that had settled into every corner of their modest home, felt her heart stop completely at the sound, because visitors were rare and uninvited visitors rarer still, and when she opened the door to find Viscount Sinclair standing on her threshold, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and his dark coat spotted with water, she could only stare at him as though he were an apparition conjured by her own treacherous imagination, some fever dream brought on by two. Many sleepless nights spent replaying the memory of his hand in hers, the warmth of his voice when he said she had chosen well. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a formality that seemed almost defensive, "I hope I am not intruding." And she heard herself inviting him in, as though from a great distance, heard herself apologizing for the state of the parlor as she led him past the threadbare carpet and the furniture that had been fine once, in her grandmother's time, before misfortune and medical bills had stripped away everything but dignity. Her father's cough echoed from the study, and Frederick's eyes moved toward the sound with something that might have been concern, and when Eleanor explained that her father was unwell, but would certainly wish to meet any visitor, Frederick followed her without hesitation into the cramped room that smelled of camphor and old books and the particular stalenesses of prolonged illness. What happened next surprised her more than his arrival had, for Frederick Sinclair, Viscount Thornbury, possessor of one of the finest estates in 3 counties, sat down beside her father's bed and began discussing Milton with the enthusiasm of a scholar rather than the condescension of a nobleman visiting the sick. And Samuel Ashworth, who had not shown such animation in months, argued points of interpretation with a vigor that brought color to his pale cheeks and tears to Eleanor's eyes as she busied herself with the tea service, the chipped china that proclaimed their genteel poverty more loudly than any words could. "I do not usually call on people," Frederick admitted to her later, when her father had dozed off and they stood together by the rain-streaked window, watching his magnificent carriage wait in the lane, the horses restless in their traces, a stark reminder of the gulf between his world and hers. "But I find myself unable to stop thinking about our conversation at the assembly, about a woman who speaks truth rather than flattery, and who tends roses rather than seeking admiration." Eleanor felt the dangerous hope unfurling in her chest again, that tender shoot she had tried so hard to crush, and she told herself this meant nothing, that he was merely curious, merely bored, that men like him did not form attachments to women like her, but when he asked if he might call again, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, she heard herself say yes, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air, terrifying and exhilarating and impossible to take back. By October 25, 1814, Frederick Sinclair had called at the Ashworth cottage 6 times in 7 days, and Eleanor had begun to allow herself the dangerous luxury of anticipation, listening for the sound of his carriage wheels on the lane each afternoon with a flutter in her chest that she could no longer entirely suppress. And on this particular day, the rain had finally relented, golden autumn light breaking through the clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks, casting everything in a honeyed glow that made even their shabby parlor seem warm and welcoming. And when Frederick arrived, he brought with him a volume of Cowper's letters that he had mentioned during their last conversation, and the sight of him remembering such a small detail, carrying it with him across the miles from Thornbury Hall, made something crack open in Eleanor's carefully guarded heart. They had fallen into a pattern now, these visits, beginning with polite inquiries about her father's health, which had stabilized enough this week that Samuel Ashworth could receive Frederick in his study for their own spirited debates about poetry and philosophy, and then progressing to the parlor where Eleanor would pour tea from the chipped china she no longer apologized for, and they would talk, really talk, in a way Eleanor had never experienced with another person, about books and ideas, and the peculiar loneliness of being misunderstood by the very society one was expected to belong to. Today Frederick laughed at something she said, a genuine laugh that transformed his usually guarded features, and Eleanor found herself laughing too, and the sound startled her because she could not remember the last time laughter had come so easily, and when their eyes met in the golden afternoon light, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, something that looked terrifyingly like tenderness. "I should like you to see my library," he said abruptly, as though the words had escaped before he could stop them, and then he seemed to remember himself, adding more formally that Thornbury Hall possessed one of the finest private collections in the county, that he thought she might appreciate it, and Eleanor knew she should refuse because unmarried women did not visit gentlemen's homes unchaperoned. But the longing in his voice matched something in her own soul, and she heard herself accepting before propriety could intervene. Frederick's face brightened in a way that made him look younger, almost boyish, and he began describing the library with an enthusiasm he usually kept carefully concealed, floor-to-ceiling shelves and a fireplace large enough to stand in, and first editions that his grandfather had collected during his travels. And Eleanor listened with a joy that frightened her because she had stopped believing such moments were possible for someone like her. Later, after he had gone, and she sat with her father in the fading light, Samuel Ashworth studied his daughter's face with knowing eyes, and said only that he had heard Lady Harriet Sinclair would be returning from London soon, and the name fell into the room like a stone into still water, rippling outward with implications Eleanor did not yet fully understand, but which cast a shadow over the golden afternoon, a reminder that happiness borrowed from worlds where she did not belong would eventually have to be returned. The morning of October 20th to 28th, 1814, dawned with a rare and precious clarity, the autumn sunshine breaking through the clouds that had shrouded the countryside for so long that Eleanor had nearly forgotten what light looked like when it was not filtered through grey. And as Frederick's carriage carried her along the winding drive toward Thornbury Hall, she pressed her face close to the window like a child, drinking in the sight of the great house rising from the landscape like something from a dream, all golden stone and tall windows that caught the sun and threw it back in dazzling fragments. And she understood in that moment why poets wrote of places as though they had souls, because Thornbury Hall seemed to breathe with a kind of melancholy grandeur that made her chest ache with emotions she could not name. Frederick helped her down from the carriage himself, his hand warm and steady beneath hers, and she saw something in his face that looked almost like nervousness, as though her opinion of his home mattered to him in a way that surprised them both. And when they entered through the great doors into a hall so vast that their footsteps echoed like whispers in a cathedral, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the cold beauty of it all, the marble floors and towering portraits and the particular silence of rooms that had known too little laughter. Mrs. Agnes Fairfax met them in the corridor leading to the library, a woman of perhaps 60 years with sharp eyes that softened when they fell upon Frederick, and softer still when she looked at Eleanor, and the housekeeper said only that she would bring tea presently. But Eleanor caught the meaningful glance she exchanged with Frederick, the slight nod that seemed to convey approval, and she understood that this visit was unprecedented, that Frederick had never brought anyone here before. The library itself stole every thought from Eleanor's mind, floor-to-ceiling shelves stretching toward a ceiling painted with clouds and angels, leather chairs positioned before a fireplace large enough to stand in, and books, thousands upon thousands of books whose spines gleamed with gold lettering in the morning light, and Eleanor moved through the space as though in a trance, her fingers trailing along volumes she had only read about, first editions and rare manuscripts and collections that would have made her father weep with joy. And when she turned to find Frederick watching her with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that it frightened her, she felt suddenly self-conscious about her obvious awe, about revealing how much this world meant to her when she had no right to belong to it. "There is a portrait I should like to show you," Frederick said quietly, and he led her to an alcove where a young woman gazed out from a gilded frame, fair and delicate as a porcelain figure. Everything Eleanor was not, and Frederick's voice grew rough as he said, her name was Amelia, that she had been his betrothed, that she died of fever 3 years ago, and he had thought he would never feel anything again until a woman in a grey dress chose not to flatter him at an assembly and made him remember what it felt like to want something. His hand moved toward hers where it rested on the chair back, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and for one suspended moment Eleanor thought he would touch her, but then something flickered in his eyes and he pulled back, and the distance between them felt like a wound. The evening of November 3rd, 1814, brought the first true frost of the season, and Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the delicate crystals form on the glass like nature's own lacework, thinking how strange it was that something so beautiful could signal the death of growing things. And she did not yet know that this frost would claim more than the last roses in her father's garden, that it heralded an ending far more significant than the close of autumn. And as she pressed her fingers to the cold pane, she allowed herself to smile at the memory of Frederick's face in the library, the way his voice had roughened when he spoke of Amelia, the almost touch that had felt more intimate than any embrace she could imagine. And she thought perhaps happiness was not something reserved for other women after all. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right moment to find her. Across the county at Thornbury Hall, Frederick Sinclair stood in the great entrance hall, watching through the tall windows as a carriage emerged from the darkness of the drive, its lamps cutting through the evening gloom like predatory eyes. And beside him, Mrs. Fairfax made a small sound of distress that she quickly suppressed, though not before Frederick caught it and felt his stomach tighten with dread, because he knew that carriage, knew the woman who sat within it, wrapped in furs and righteous certainty, knew that the fragile peace of these past weeks was about to shatter like the frost forming on the windows of Eleanor's modest cottage miles away. Lady Harriet Sinclair descended from her carriage with the imperial bearing of a woman who had never been denied anything she truly wanted, and though she was 58 years old, her spine remained rigid as iron, her eyes sharp as broken glass, and when she looked at her son there was calculation rather than warmth in her gaze, assessment rather than affection, and Frederick felt himself becoming the boy he had been at 10, at 15, at 20, diminished by her presence in ways he had thought he had outgrown. "I have heard the most distressing rumours," Lady Harriet said, before she had even removed her travelling cloak, her voice carrying through the marble hall with the precision of a blade, rumours about unsuitable attachments and forgotten obligations, and a young woman of no consequence whatsoever, and Frederick opened his mouth to respond, but found his voice trapped somewhere behind his heart, where Eleanor's laughter still echoed, and his mother smiled the way she always smiled when she sensed victory within reach. Later that night, after Lady Harriet had retired to her chambers and the great house had fallen into its usual oppressive silence, Frederick sat at his desk composing a note by candlelight, his hand unsteady as he wrote words that felt like both betrayal and protection, and when he sealed the letter and summoned a servant to deliver it to Miss Ashworth at first light, he felt something precious slipping through his fingers like water, like time, like the last warmth of autumn giving way to winter's inevitable approach. Eleanor received the note the following morning, her father's cough echoing through the cottage as she broke the seal with trembling fingers, and the words blurred before her eyes as she read them once, twice, 3 times. "Do not come to the hall until I send word," and the happiness she had allowed herself to feel turned to ash in her chest, even as she pressed the paper to her heart, even as she whispered his name into the cold morning air like a prayer she no longer believed would be answered. The afternoon of November 5th, 1814, arrived under skies the colour of bruised pewter, and Eleanor sat by her father's bedside, listening to the rattle of his breathing, while her thoughts circled endlessly around Frederick's silence, around the note that had told her nothing except to wait. And she had waited for 2 days now, with no further word, while her father's cough grew worse, and her hope grew thin as the worn fabric of her winter cloak. And when she heard the sound of a carriage in the lane, she rose with her heart pounding, only to watch through the window as Clara descended in her new fur-trimmed pelisse, her face arranged in an expression of satisfied concern that Eleanor recognized from their childhood as the prelude to cruelty, delivered under the guise of sisterly duty. Clara swept into the cottage without waiting to be admitted, her eyes cataloguing every shabby surface and threadbare cushion as though compiling evidence of Eleanor's failures. And when she settled herself in the best chair and accepted tea she did not want, she said she had come bearing a message from Lady Harriet Sinclair herself, delivered at a gathering Eleanor had not been invited to attend, and Eleanor felt the cold begin to spread through her chest even before Clara spoke the words that would confirm every dark suspicion she had tried to keep at bay. Lady Harriet had made her views abundantly clear to the assembled company, Clara reported with barely concealed relish, stating that her son's momentary interest in that plain Ashworth girl was nothing more than charitable condescension, that Eleanor was beneath consideration for any serious attachment, and that anyone who encouraged such delusions was doing the poor creature no kindness at all, and Clara paused to sip her unwanted tea before adding that Lady Harriet had already written to Lady Diana Montague's family to formalize arrangements for a far more suitable match. Eleanor sat perfectly still as her sister's words washed over her like ice water, and she thought of Frederick's voice rough with emotion in the library, of his hand nearly touching hers before he pulled away, of the note that had promised further word that had not come, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had committed the unforgivable sin of hoping for something beyond her station, beyond her plain face and unfashionable dresses and empty dowry. And Clara watched her with hungry eyes, waiting for tears that Eleanor refused to shed, because she had learned long ago that her sister fed on weakness the way others fed on bread. It was not until after Clara had departed, satisfied with the damage she had wrought, that Eleanor found the second note tucked beneath the door, written in a hand she recognized, and her fingers trembled as she read the words that Frederick must have sent by a trusted servant, even as Clara was delivering his mother's poison. And the message was brief, but it burned through the cold that had settled in her heart. 7 words that asked everything and promised nothing except that he had not abandoned her after all. "Meet me at the old chapel," it said, "tomorrow at dawn." And Eleanor pressed the paper to her lips and tasted salt, and knew she would go despite the scandal and the danger, because some chances came only once, and she had spent 26 years being sensible, and perhaps it was finally time to be brave instead. The morning of November 6th, 1814, arrived wrapped in mist so thick that Eleanor could barely see the garden gate as she slipped from the cottage before dawn, her worn cloak pulled tight against the bitter cold that had settled into her bones long before she stepped outside, and she moved through the grey world like a ghost herself, past the frost-covered hedgerows and the sleeping houses of neighbours who would condemn her utterly if they knew where she was going and why. And with each step she felt the weight of 26 years of propriety warring against the desperate hope that had kept her awake all night. And she thought that perhaps this was what courage felt like, not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it, despite everything. The old chapel emerged from the mist like something from a dream, its ancient stones softened by centuries of ivy that clung to the walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And Eleanor paused at the rusted gate to the small graveyard that surrounded it, her breath forming clouds in the cold air as she searched the shadows for any sign of Frederick. And for one terrible moment she thought she had been foolish to come, that Clara had been right, and she was nothing but a plain spinster, grasping at fantasies that would only leave her more broken than before. And then she saw him standing beneath the chapel's arched doorway, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dim light. And something inside her chest cracked open, like ice giving way to spring. He moved toward her without speaking, and Eleanor saw in his face the same desperate hope she felt in her own heart, the same fear of discovery, and the same inability to stay away. And when he reached her, he took both her hands in his, and she gasped at the warmth of his touch, because her fingers had gone numb with cold, and he looked down at their joined hands and made a sound of distress before pulling off his own gloves and pressing them onto her frozen fingers with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. "I could not stay away," Frederick said, his voice rough in the morning stillness, and Eleanor shook her head because she understood, because she had walked through the dawn mist to this forgotten place, despite every sensible thought that told her to remain safely in her bed. And Frederick continued speaking in a rush, as though the words had been building inside him for days, telling her about his mother's plans for Lady Diana Montague, about the ultimatum that had been delivered with cold precision, about the fortune that hung in the balance if he refused to comply. And Eleanor listened with her heart pounding, as he said that none of it mattered because he could not stop thinking of her, because she had become necessary to him in ways he could not explain. And she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the church bells in the village began to toll the hour, their sound carrying through the mist like a warning, and Frederick pressed her gloved hands to his chest where she could feel his heart racing beneath the fine wool of his coat, and he whispered that they must go before they were discovered, but that she must know, she must understand that his regard for her was not casual or fleeting. And Eleanor nodded because she could not speak, and they separated into the mist as the bells continued their relentless count of the hour. The evening of November 10th, 1814, found Eleanor standing in her sister's drawing room, wearing the dove-grey dress that had become a uniform of her invisibility, and she had not wanted to come to this dinner party. But Clara had insisted with that particular tone that suggested refusal would be met with weeks of pointed comments about ingratitude and family duty, and so Eleanor had walked through the heavy rain that had not stopped for days, and arrived with her hem soaked and her hair escaping its pins to find that the room was already full of faces that turned toward her with expressions ranging from pity to amusement, and then her heart stopped entirely because there at the center of the room stood Frederick, beside a woman who could only be Lady Harriet Sinclair, her silver hair swept up beneath an elaborate headdress, her eyes sharp as winter ice as they catalogued Eleanor's every flaw with the precision of a merchant assessing inferior goods. Lady Diana Montague stood at Frederick's other side, golden and delicate in pale blue silk, everything Eleanor was not, and Eleanor watched Frederick's face go rigid when he saw her, watched him take a half step forward before his mother's hand closed on his arm with the grip of a falcon's talon, and she understood then that this dinner had been arranged specifically for this moment, that Clara had been recruited as an instrument of her humiliation, and the understanding settled into her bones like the cold that had never quite left her since the morning in the chapel. The evening proceeded with excruciating slowness, as Eleanor was seated at the far end of the table, away from Frederick, close enough to hear Lady Harriet's carrying voice as she discussed the many accomplishments of Lady Diana, and then paused with theatrical consideration before adding that some young women were better suited to useful work than ornamental marriages, that a governess position might be quite appropriate for those lacking the advantages of beauty or fortune, and several guests laughed while Clara looked away, and Frederick's hands tightened on his silverware until his knuckles went white. He spoke then, his voice cutting through the laughter with an edge Eleanor had never heard, saying that he had always found that true worth revealed itself in character rather than superficial advantages, and the table fell silent as Lady Harriet's face hardened and Lady Diana looked confused, and Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes that she refused to shed because she would not give them the satisfaction. And when the interminable meal finally ended, she slipped away without farewells, walking out into the rain that soaked through her thin cloak within moments, and she did not look back even when she heard footsteps behind her, even when Frederick's voice called her name, because she knew that if she turned around she would shatter completely, and she had learned long ago that broken things were simply thrown away, and so she walked home alone through the storm while Frederick stood helpless in the doorway, watching her disappear into the darkness. The night of November 12th, 1814, shattered into fragments of terror when Eleanor heard the crash from her father's study and ran to find him collapsed on the floor beside his desk, his face grey as ash and his breathing so shallow that she pressed her ear to his chest to be certain his heart still beat, and she screamed for the housekeeper. And together they lifted him onto the narrow bed that had been moved into the study weeks ago when the stairs became too difficult, and Eleanor sent the boy who helped with the horses racing through the storm to fetch Dr. Whitmore while she knelt beside her father and held his hand and whispered promises she had no power to keep, and the rain that had not stopped for days hammered against the windows like something desperate to get inside. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his coat soaked through, and his expression grave as he examined Mr. Ashworth with gentle hands that could not hide the worry in his eyes. And when he finally straightened and drew Eleanor aside, his voice was low and careful as he explained that the illness had progressed beyond what he had feared, that the lungs were filling with fluid, and the heart was struggling under the strain, and Eleanor heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away, as though she were under water and drowning alongside her father. And Dr. Whitmore pressed a bottle of medicine into her hands, and told her to keep him warm, keep him comfortable, and send for him immediately if there was any change. And then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with the sound of her father's labored breathing and the relentless rain. She did not think of Frederick that night, or the next day, did not think of anything except the rhythm of spooning broth between her father's cracked lips and changing the cool cloths on his forehead, and reading aloud from his favorite books when his eyes fluttered open because she could not bear the silence, and the hours blurred together into an endless vigil marked only by Dr. Whitmore's visits and the slow dimming and brightening of the grey light through the windows, and Eleanor felt herself becoming something stripped of everything except this single purpose, this desperate determination to hold her father in the world through sheer force of will. She had not slept in 48 hours when the knock came at the door on the evening of the second day, and she rose from her chair with joints that ached and a head that swam with exhaustion, expecting Dr. Whitmore or perhaps Clara finally come to help. And when she opened the door to find Frederick standing in the rain with water streaming from his dark hair and his fine coat ruined and his eyes wild with worry, she could only stare at him as though he were an apparition. And he said her name once, just her name, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest give way entirely because he had come, despite everything, despite his mother and society and propriety and the storm that still raged around them both. He had come to find her. The hours that followed existed outside of time, suspended in the amber glow of candlelight and the rhythm of her father's labored breathing. And Frederick did not ask permission or offer explanations, but simply removed his soaked coat and rolled his sleeves, and asked Eleanor what needed to be done. And she found herself directing him to fetch water from the kitchen and to stoke the fire that had burned low, and to help her lift her father higher on the pillows when his breathing grew too shallow. And Frederick did all of this without hesitation or complaint, his fine linen shirt dampening with sweat and his hands gentle as they supported Mr. Ashworth's frail shoulders. And Eleanor watched him through eyes blurred with exhaustion and felt something shift inside her chest, some final wall crumbling that she had not even known she was still maintaining. The storm raged outside with a fury that seemed personal, wind howling around the corners of the modest house, and rain lashing, the windows in waves, but inside the small sick room there was only the quiet work of keeping death at bay, and sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, Eleanor felt her legs give way beneath her, and Frederick caught her before she could fall, his arms coming around her with a sureness that suggested he had been waiting for this moment, and he guided her to the worn armchair beside the bed, and knelt before her, and took her hands in his, and said her name in a voice so tender it broke something open inside her that she had kept locked away since her mother died. She wept then, truly wept for the first time since her father's collapse, great shuddering sobs that she tried to stifle because she did not want to disturb the fragile peace of the sick room. But Frederick would not let her retreat into silence, and instead he gathered her against his chest and held her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. And he whispered words she could not quite hear, but understood nonetheless, promises and reassurances and something that sounded almost like love. Her father stirred some time later, his eyes opening with more clarity than Eleanor had seen in days, and he looked at Frederick kneeling beside his daughter, with her tears soaking into his ruined shirt, and something passed across his weathered face that might have been peace. And he nodded once, slowly, deliberately, before his eyes closed again and his breathing settled into something easier. And Eleanor felt Frederick's arms tighten around her, as if he too understood what that nod had meant. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to grey light filtering through the windows, and a blanket draped over her shoulders that smelled of rain and cedar and something uniquely Frederick. And when she turned her head, she found him standing at the window, watching the storm finally break apart over the eastern hills. and he looked back at her with eyes dark with exhaustion and something fiercer. And he crossed to her, and bent and pressed his lips to her forehead, in a kiss so gentle it felt like a benediction. And then he was gone into the pale dawn. The days that followed Frederick's dawn departure blurred together in a haze of medicine and prayer and the slow, miraculous return of colour to her father's cheeks. And by November 18th, 1814, Mr. Samuel Ashworth was sitting up in bed with pillows propped behind him and enough strength to hold a book in his own hands, though Dr. Whitmore warned that the recovery was fragile. And the lungs still bore the scars of the illness that had nearly claimed him, and Eleanor moved through the house with a lightness she had not felt in weeks, opening curtains to let in the pale afternoon sunshine that seemed like a gift after so many days of storm and shadow. Frederick came every day now, openly and without pretense, his fine carriage announcing his presence to the entire village and setting tongues wagging in ways that Eleanor knew would reach Lady Harriet's ears if they had not already. But when she tried to warn him of the cost he might pay for such public devotion, he only smiled and pressed another book into her hands and asked if he might sit with her father for a while, and Mr. Ashworth would nod from his bed with that same quiet approval he had shown on the night of the storm, and the two men would speak of poetry and philosophy, while Eleanor watched from the doorway with her heart so full she feared it might burst. Clara came on the afternoon of the 5th day, her face pinched with disapproval and her new baby left at home with the wet nurse, and she found Frederick reading aloud to their father while Eleanor prepared tea in the kitchen, and the silence that fell when Clara entered the room was heavy with unspoken accusations until she drew Eleanor aside and hissed that she was a fool, that Lady Harriet had issued an ultimatum and Frederick would lose everything if he continued this madness. And did Eleanor truly believe a Viscount would sacrifice his fortune and his future for a plain spinster with nothing to offer but a dying father and a threadbare wardrobe? And Eleanor listened to her sister's cruelty with a calm that surprised them both, and said nothing at all. But later that afternoon, when Frederick found her in the garden staring at the bare branches where roses had bloomed just weeks before, he took her hands in his and told her everything. How his mother had demanded he end this attachment immediately or forfeit his inheritance. How Lady Diana Montague waited in London expecting an offer that would never come. How he had looked at the life his mother had planned for him and found it empty of everything that mattered. And when Eleanor protested that she could not let him sacrifice so much for her, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with eyes that held no doubt, and said that she was not the sacrifice but the salvation, that the money meant nothing without someone to share it with who saw him as he truly was, rather than as a title to be acquired. And then he kissed her, softly at first, and then with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart sing. And Eleanor kissed him back, with all the hope she had been afraid to feel. The evening of November 22nd, 1814, arrived wrapped in the particular stillness that comes before the first true snow of winter, and Eleanor sat beside the fire in her father's parlour, with a book open in her lap, that she had not read a single word of, because her eyes kept drifting to the window, where the sky had turned the colour of pewter, and the bare branches of the oak tree scratched against the glass like fingers seeking entrance. And when Frederick's knock came at the door, her heart leapt into her throat with a violence that made her press her hand to her chest as if she could quiet its frantic beating through sheer force of will. He entered the parlour with snowflakes melting in his dark hair and his cheeks flushed from the cold and something in his expression that Eleanor had never seen before, a quality of settled certainty that made him seem both younger and older than his 32 years, and when he took her hands in his and drew her to stand before the fire, she trembled not from cold, but from the weight of what she sensed was coming. Her father slept in the next room, his breathing audible through the thin walls, a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how precious every moment of connection became, when you understood that nothing lasted forever. And Frederick seemed to hear that breathing too, because he glanced toward the closed door with something like gratitude, before turning back to Eleanor with eyes that held depths she was only beginning to understand. He spoke her name first, just Eleanor, without the miss that propriety demanded, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch even as he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a ring that caught the firelight and scattered it across the modest walls like captured stars, and he told her it had belonged to his grandmother, the only woman in his family who had ever married for love rather than advantage, and that he had carried it with him for 3 days, waiting for the courage to offer it properly. Eleanor tried to speak then, tried to voice all the objections that crowded her mind about her plainness and her poverty and her unsuitability for, well, the role of Viscountess, but Frederick pressed his finger gently to her lips and said he knew what she was thinking because she had told him 100 times in 100 small ways that she believed herself unworthy of happiness, and he was asking her now to trust him when he said that she was wrong, that she was the only woman he had ever met who made him want to be better than he was, the only one who saw past his title to the lonely man beneath, the only one who made the great empty halls of Thornbury feel like they might someday become a home. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, and when Frederick kissed her this time, it was not gentle or questioning, but fierce with promise. And outside the window, the first snow of winter began to fall in earnest, blanketing the world in white silence, while inside the modest parlor, 2 people who had both given up on love found themselves believing in it again. The morning of November 25th, 1814, dawned cold and bright with the kind of crystalline winter sunlight that turned the snow-covered fields into fields of diamonds, and Eleanor woke to find her grandmother's ring still on her finger, where she had refused to remove it even for sleep, and for one long moment she simply lay in bed watching the light play across the simple gold band, and wondering if the past 3 days had been nothing more than a fever dream conjured by exhaustion and longing. But the weight of the ring was real, and the memory of Frederick's kiss was real. And somewhere in the great cold halls of Thornbury, a man she loved was preparing to face his mother's wrath for her sake. Clara arrived before noon with her face arranged in an expression of sisterly concern that fooled no one, and when Eleanor showed her the ring, Clara's eyes widened with something that might have been envy before it hardened into the familiar disdain, and she said that Eleanor was mad to think Lady Harriet would ever accept this match, that Frederick would come to his senses when he realized what he was sacrificing, that plain spinsters did not become Viscountesses no matter what promises were made in the firelight of modest parlors, and Eleanor listened to every poisonous word with a calm she had learned in weeks of nursing her father through his illness, and said only that she was sorry Clara could not be happy for her, but that she intended to marry Frederick Sinclair regardless of anyone's approval. Her father called her to his bedside that afternoon when Clara had gone and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, and he took her hand in his and looked at her with eyes that held both joy and sorrow. And he told her that he had spoken with Frederick about more than books during those long afternoons of his recovery, that the young Viscount had confessed his love and his fears and his determination to build a life worthy of Eleanor's trust, and that Mr. Ashworth had given his blessing not because Frederick was wealthy or titled, but because he was the first man to see in Eleanor what her father had always seen, a woman of depth and courage and quiet fire who deserved to be cherished rather than overlooked. The tears came then, tears Eleanor had not allowed herself to shed through all the weeks of uncertainty and hope and terror, and her father held her as he had when she was a child, and told her that her mother would have been proud, that the greatest regret of his life was that Eleanor had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love because society had taught her that plainness was a failing rather than simply a fact, and that if he could give her nothing else before he died, he wanted to give her permission to be happy without apology. Frederick came at dusk with snow in his hair and defiance in his eyes, and he told Eleanor that Lady Harriet had received news of the engagement and had declared she would never acknowledge the marriage, and Eleanor asked if he was certain this was what he wanted, and he answered by pulling her into his arms. The wedding took place on December 3rd, 1814, in the small stone chapel where they had once met at dawn with mist curling around their ankles and fear curling around their hearts, and Eleanor wore not the elaborate gown that a viscountess might be expected to wear, but a simple dress of ivory wool that Mrs. Fairfax had helped her alter from a gown that had belonged to Frederick's grandmother, the same woman whose ring now sat upon Eleanor's finger as a promise that love could triumph over expectation if only one had the courage to reach for it. The pews were nearly empty because Lady Harriet had made it known throughout the county that anyone who attended would find themselves unwelcome at Thornbury Hall, and at any gathering she deemed worthy of her presence. But Eleanor found she did not mind the empty seats because the ones that mattered were filled with her father sitting wrapped in blankets with colour in his cheeks and tears on his weathered face, with Mrs. Fairfax dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had embroidered with the Sinclair crest, with Dr. Whitmore, who had become something like a friend through the long nights of her father's illness, and even with Clara, who had come at the last moment with her infant daughter in her arms, and something that might have been shame softening the hard edges of her expression. Frederick stood at the altar with snowlight streaming through the chapel windows and turning his dark hair silver at the temples, and when Eleanor walked toward him on her father's trembling arm, she saw in his eyes not the cold distance that had marked their first meeting at the assembly, but a warmth so profound it seemed to transform the very air between them into something sacred and shimmering. The vicar spoke words that Eleanor would later struggle to remember, because her entire being was focused on the pressure of Frederick's hands holding hers, and the way his voice cracked almost imperceptibly when he spoke his vows, and the knowledge that she was about to become his wife, despite every force that had conspired to convince them both that such happiness was not meant for people like them. When he kissed her to seal their union, it was gentle and brief and appropriate for a church. But his eyes promised more, promised a lifetime of mornings waking beside each other, and evenings reading by the fire, and conversations that wandered through philosophy and literature, and the small intimate details of daily life that no one else would ever share. They emerged from the chapel into a world transformed by fresh snowfall, and Eleanor paused on the threshold to look back at the place where she had once stood shivering in her worn cloak, wondering if she was mad to hope. And Frederick squeezed her hand as if he understood exactly what she was thinking, as if he too was marveling at the distance they had travelled from uncertainty to this moment of impossible joy. The first weeks of marriage unfolded like pages from a book Eleanor had never dared to read, each day revealing new chapters of a life she had been taught to believe was not written for women like her. And Thornbury Hall transformed under her presence, from a cold monument to duty, into something that almost resembled a home, with fires burning in rooms that had stood dark for years, and laughter echoing through corridors that had known only silence and footsteps that moved with purpose rather than obligation. Frederick watched her with an expression she was still learning to recognize as wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real, as if he feared that turning away for even a moment might cause her to vanish like morning mist burned away by harsh sunlight. And Eleanor found herself reaching for his hand at odd moments throughout the day simply to reassure them both that this happiness was solid and lasting and true. Lady Harriet had made good on her threat to cut Frederick from the family fortune, but the title and the estate were entailed and could not be taken, and they discovered together that wealth measured in love rather than pounds. Sterling was more than sufficient to build a life worth living, though Eleanor sometimes caught Mrs. Fairfax counting coins with furrowed brow and knew that economies would need to be made in ways the household had never before considered. Her father visited when his health permitted, carried in Frederick's carriage, and settled by the library fire where he and his son-in-law would debate philosophy for hours, while Eleanor pretended to read and actually watched them with a heart so full it seemed impossible that she had ever believed herself destined for emptiness. And on these evenings she would sometimes look at the portrait of Amelia that still hung in the far corner of the room, and feel not jealousy, but gratitude that Frederick had known love before, and therefore understood how to give it, how to receive it, how to let it grow without fear. The snow continued through December and into January, blanketing the grounds of Thornbury in white silence that made their happiness feel even more protected from the world beyond. And it was on a morning in late January, when the snow had finally begun to melt, and the first tentative signs of spring were pushing through the frozen earth, that Eleanor woke with a wave of nausea so sudden and fierce that she barely reached the basin in time. And when the sickness passed, she sat very still on the edge of the bed, with her hand pressed against her stomach, and her mind racing through calculations she had been too afraid to make. Frederick found her there an hour later, still sitting in her nightgown, with tears streaming down her face and terror in her eyes. And before she could speak, he was kneeling before her, asking what was wrong, and when she told him she thought she might be with child. His face went through a series of transformations she could not quite read before settling into something that looked like joy, shadowed by an emotion she would later recognize as fear. Dr. Whitmore arrived at Thornbury Hall within hours of Frederick's urgent summons, his weathered medical bag clutched in hands that had steadied Eleanor through her father's illness, and now must guide her through this new uncertainty. And after an examination conducted with gentle professionalism, while Frederick paced the corridor outside like a caged animal, the physician confirmed what Eleanor had suspected, with words that should have brought joy, but instead seemed to fill the room with a strange and heavy silence. She was indeed with child, perhaps 6 weeks along by his estimation, and while he offered congratulations, his eyes held something cautious that Eleanor could not quite decipher, a shadow of concern that he masked quickly, but not quickly enough for her to miss. Frederick burst through the door the moment Dr. Whitmore emerged, searching Eleanor's face for answers she did not know how to give. And when she nodded, he crossed to her in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath. He spoke of nurseries and names and the future stretching before them like an unwritten book filled with possibility. But Eleanor heard beneath his words the same undercurrent of fear she had seen in his eyes that first morning. And when night fell, and they lay together in the darkness, she finally asked him what he was afraid to say. His answer came slowly, pulled from some deep place he had kept locked since before she knew him, and as he spoke of Amelia, she understood at last the full weight of the grief he carried. For Amelia had not simply died of illness, as Eleanor had assumed from the careful way people spoke of her, but had died in childbed, the baby lost with her, and Frederick had stood helpless at her bedside and watched the woman he loved slip away while bringing forth a life that never drew breath. The words hung between them in the dark bedroom, and Eleanor felt the cold hand of her mother's fate reaching across the years to touch her. For she too had died bringing a child into the world, and that child had been Eleanor herself, a truth she had carried since girlhood like a stone in her chest. She told Frederick this now, her voice steady despite the trembling that had taken hold of her body, and she felt his arms tighten around her as though he could hold her safe through sheer force of will, and they lay there together in the winter darkness with the fire burning low and the weight of their shared fears pressing down upon them like snowfall, silent and relentless and cold. In the days that followed, a change came over Frederick that Eleanor struggled to name, a watchfulness that bordered on obsession, a tendency to hover near her as though she might shatter at any moment, and she found herself torn between gratitude for his devotion and a growing frustration at being treated like glass when she had spent her entire life proving herself stronger than anyone believed. The tension between them grew like frost spreading across a window pane, invisible at first but slowly obscuring the clarity they had found together, and Eleanor watched as Frederick's love transformed into something that felt increasingly like a cage built from the finest intentions, his every gesture of care carrying within it the unspoken message that she was fragile and failing and in need of constant protection from herself. She was forbidden from climbing stairs without his arm to steady her, forbidden from walking in the garden when the ground was damp, forbidden from lifting anything heavier than a book. And while she understood that his fear came from a place of deep and genuine love, she could not help but feel that the woman he had married was disappearing beneath layers of caution and restriction until she hardly recognized herself in the anxious creature who moved through Thornbury Hall like a ghost afraid of disturbing the living. Dr. Whitmore visited weekly now, his examinations thorough and his pronouncements cautiously optimistic. though Eleanor noticed that he always spoke to Frederick first and longest, as though she were merely the vessel being discussed rather than a person with her own understanding of her body and its workings. And this small indignity rankled more than she wished to admit. Her father came less frequently as winter deepened, his own health too precarious for regular travel, and Eleanor missed his steady presence and the way he had always spoken to her as though her thoughts mattered, as though she possessed a mind worth consulting rather than merely a womb worth protecting. Clara visited once, her manner coolly satisfied as she surveyed Eleanor's expanding waistline and offered advice that landed like small, sharp stones, reminding Eleanor that she herself had delivered 2 healthy children without any of this fuss, and perhaps Eleanor was simply being dramatic about perfectly natural discomfort, and Eleanor sat in silence and smiled, and counted the minutes until her sister's carriage departed. The dreams began in February, dark and formless things that left Eleanor gasping awake in the small hours with her hands pressed against her belly and her heart racing with terror she could not name. And Frederick would gather her close and whisper reassurances, but she could feel his body trembling against hers with a fear that matched her own. She dreamed of her mother, a woman she had never known except through her father's careful stories, and in these dreams her mother stood at the foot of the bed with empty arms and a face full of sorrow, reaching toward Eleanor as though trying to warn her of something that words could not convey. She dreamed of Amelia too, the fair and delicate woman from the portrait, and in these dreams Amelia smiled sadly and shook her head as though Eleanor had failed some test she had not known she was taking. The baby moved constantly now, small flutterings that grew into kicks and rolls that Eleanor could see rippling across her skin, and she would press Frederick's hand against her belly so he could feel this life they had created together, and watch his face transform from fear into wonder and back again within the space of a single heartbeat. The confrontation came on a March morning when the snow had finally begun to melt and the first tentative shoots of green were pushing through the frozen earth, and Eleanor was sitting in the morning room with a book she could not concentrate on when Frederick entered with a face she did not recognize, pale and set and terrible in its stillness. And she knew before he spoke that something had shifted between them in the night while she slept. He sat beside her and took her hands in his, and his grip was too tight, his fingers cold despite the fire burning in the grate, and when he finally spoke his voice was hoarse as though the words had been scraped raw from his throat. He had been to see Dr. Whitmore that morning, he told her, had gone alone while she slept because he could not bear another night of watching her face during the examinations, another night of reading the careful concern in the physician's eyes, and Dr. Whitmore had finally spoken plainly to him in a way he had not spoken in Eleanor's presence. The pregnancy was progressing, but there were signs that troubled him, a weakness in Eleanor's constitution that reminded him of other cases he had seen, cases that had ended badly. And while he could not say with certainty that Eleanor faced the same fate, he could not in good conscience offer false reassurance. Frederick's voice broke as he relayed these words, and Eleanor watched his face crumble into something raw and desperate, and when he finally looked at her, his eyes held a plea that made her blood run cold. "There were ways," he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "There were things that could be done early enough, dangerous and illegal and morally fraught but possible, ways to end the pregnancy before it ended her." And he was begging her on his knees now with his head pressed against her swollen belly and his shoulders shaking with sobs, begging her to choose him, to choose life, to choose a future where they could try again when she was stronger or simply exist together without children, if that was the cost of keeping her alive. Eleanor sat frozen as his words washed over her, understanding slowly dawning like winter sunrise, cold and pale and merciless, and she felt something harden within her chest even as her heart shattered at the sight of his grief. He was asking her to choose, she realized, asking her to weigh her life against the life growing within her, asking her to make a calculation that no mother should ever be forced to make. And in that moment she understood with terrible clarity that she could not give him what he wanted, could not sacrifice this child they had created together even to save herself, could not live with the hollow victory of survival purchased at such a price. She lifted his face in her hands and kissed his forehead the way he had kissed hers on that first morning when hope was new, and she told him no, and watched his world collapse around them both. The days that followed her refusal were the loneliest Eleanor had ever known, lonelier even than the years of invisibility before Frederick had seen her across that assembly room, lonelier than the nights she had spent watching her father struggle for breath, because this loneliness existed in the presence of another person in the shared bed where Frederick now lay with his back to her, in the meals they took together in silence, broken only by the scrape of silver against porcelain, in the careful way he handed her into chairs and upstairs without once meeting her eyes. He had not argued further after her refusal, had not raged or pleaded or tried to change her mind, and in some ways his quiet acceptance was worse than resistance would have been, because it spoke of something broken between them that might never be mended, a fracture that ran through the foundation of everything they had built together. Mrs. Fairfax moved through Thornbury Hall like a ghost herself now, her kind eyes troubled as she watched the young couple who had brought such brief joy to these cold halls retreat into separate sorrows, and she brought Eleanor extra blankets and warm milk without being asked, small kindnesses that made Eleanor weep when she was alone. The March winds howled around the ancient stones and rattled the windows of the library where Eleanor no longer went because she could not bear to sit in the chair where Frederick had once read poetry aloud to her, could not bear to see the portrait of Amelia and wonder if she too had faced this impossible choice and chosen differently or not been given the choice at all. Lady Harriet wrote letters from London that Frederick burned without reading, and Eleanor watched the papers curl and blacken in the fireplace, and wondered what words of triumph his mother had penned, wondered if Lady Harriet somehow knew that her son's marriage was crumbling from within even as it had survived every external assault. The baby grew larger, and Eleanor grew weaker, her appetite failing despite Mrs. Fairfax's increasingly desperate culinary efforts, her sleep fractured by dreams that left her more exhausted than rest should allow, and Dr. Whitmore's visits grew more frequent, and his examinations more thorough, and his conversations with Frederick longer and more hushed. She wrote to her father but did not tell him of the rift, could not bear to add worry to his fragile recovery, and her letters spoke of spring approaching and the child's movements and Frederick's devotion in terms that felt like lies even as she formed the words. Clara sent a brief note announcing her intention to visit in April, and Eleanor could not decide if she dreaded or welcomed the prospect of her sister's sharp eyes seeing what she could not hide, the distance between husband and wife that no amount of careful performance could disguise. The old chapel where Frederick had first held her hands stood empty in the churchyard, its ivy beginning to green with new growth, and Eleanor walked there alone one afternoon when the sun broke briefly through the clouds, stood among the gravestones and pressed her hands against her belly and whispered promises to the child within, promises that she would love it enough for both parents if Frederick could not find his way back to them. The first pains came in the night of April the 3rd, 3 weeks before Dr. Whitmore had predicted, and Eleanor woke to a sensation like iron bands tightening around her middle and a wetness spreading beneath her that she knew instinctively meant the child was coming whether any of them were ready or not. She called out for Frederick, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, and she had to call again, louder this time, before she heard movement in the dressing room where he had taken to sleeping these past weeks, unable to share her bed, but unwilling to leave her entirely alone in the night. He appeared in the doorway with a candle in his hand and his face slack with sleep, and then the light fell upon her, and she watched comprehension dawn in his eyes, watched terror replace confusion, watched him become, in that instant, the man she had married rather than the stranger he had been since her refusal. He was beside her in 3 strides, his hand finding hers in the darkness, and he was shouting for Mrs. Fairfax and sending servants running for Dr. Whitmore, and his voice was steady even as his fingers trembled against her palm. The hours that followed blurred together in Eleanor's memory like watercolors bleeding into one another, pain and pressure, and the faces of people moving around her bed. Dr. Whitmore's calm instructions, and Mrs. Fairfax's cool cloths against her forehead, and Frederick's hand that she gripped until her knuckles went white, and still he did not pull away. She heard herself making sounds she did not recognize, animal sounds that seemed to come from somewhere outside her body, and she felt herself splitting apart from the inside, and wondered if this was how her mother had felt in the hours before Eleanor's birth took her life. The dawn came grey and cold through the windows, and still the child would not come, and Dr. Whitmore's face grew more serious with each examination, and Eleanor saw him draw Frederick aside and speak words she could not hear, but could read in the way her husband's shoulders bowed, as though bearing a weight too heavy for any man. Frederick returned to her side and knelt beside the bed and pressed his forehead against their joined hands, and she felt wetness that might have been tears or sweat falling onto her skin. She wanted to tell him she was sorry. Sorry for choosing the baby over him, sorry for the distance of these past weeks. Sorry that she might leave him alone in this cold hall with nothing but portraits of dead women to keep him company. But another wave of pain crashed over her and stole her breath and her words and everything except the primitive drive to push this child from her body. And then, as the clock struck 10 on that grey April morning, the room filled with a thin wail that was the most beautiful and terrible sound Eleanor had ever heard, and Dr. Whitmore lifted a small red creature into the candlelight, and Eleanor saw her daughter for the first and last time before the darkness rose, up to claim her. Eleanor woke to silence, and for a moment she did not know where she was or what had happened, or why her body felt as though it had been torn apart and reassembled by careless hands. And then memory crashed over her like a wave, and she tried to sit up and could not, tried to speak, and produced only a ragged whisper that brought Mrs. Fairfax rushing to her bedside, with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The baby," Eleanor managed to say, and watched the housekeeper's face crumple in a way that told her everything before any words were spoken. Watched the older woman reach for her hand and hold it tight as though she could anchor Eleanor to this world through sheer force of will. "She lived for 4 hours," Mrs. Fairfax said, her voice breaking on each word. She was too small, and her lungs were not ready, and Dr. Whitmore did everything he could, but she simply was not strong enough to stay. Eleanor heard the words but could not make them mean anything, could not connect them to the child she had carried for 8 months, the child she had chosen over her husband's desperate plea, the child she had loved before she ever saw her face and would love long after she had forgotten what that face looked like. "Where is Frederick?" she asked, and something flickered in Mrs. Fairfax's eyes that looked like fear or pity, or perhaps both. "He is in the nursery," the housekeeper replied. "He has not left since she passed. He is holding her and will not let anyone take her away." Eleanor tried again to rise, and this time Mrs. Fairfax helped her, wrapping her in blankets and supporting her weight as they made the terrible journey down the corridor to the room that had been prepared with such hopeful care, the room with the cradle that Frederick had commissioned from London, and the tiny gowns that Eleanor had embroidered through the long winter evenings, and the rocking chair where she had imagined sitting with her daughter in the quiet hours before dawn. He was there, as Mrs. Fairfax had said, sitting in that rocking chair with a bundle of white linen in his arms, and when he looked up at Eleanor, his face was so ravaged by grief that she barely recognized the man she had married. "She was perfect," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of weeping. "She had your eyes and my mother's chin, and she looked at me, and I think she knew. I think she knew I was her father, and that I loved her even though I did not want her to come, even though I asked you to let her go." Eleanor crossed the room on legs that threatened to give way with every step, and sank down beside him and looked at her daughter for the first time since that brief glimpse in the delivery room, looked at the small, still face that was indeed perfect, that was peaceful in a way that suggested she had simply fallen asleep and might wake at any moment demanding to be fed. "I am sorry," Frederick whispered. I am so sorry I asked you to choose." And Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder and wept for the child they had made together and lost together and would mourn together for the rest of their lives. They buried her on April the 7th in the small churchyard beside the chapel where Frederick and Eleanor had once met at dawn to speak words of hope and longing, and the spring that had seemed so cruel in its brightness now turned grey and cold, as though even the heavens understood that joy had no place in this corner of the world. Eleanor stood beside the tiny grave in a black dress that Mrs. Fairfax had hastily altered from one of Lady Harriet's abandoned mourning gowns, and she watched the sexton lower the small white coffin into the earth, and tried to make herself believe that this was real, that the child she had carried and fought for and chosen was truly gone, that all of it had been for nothing. Frederick stood beside her with his hand gripping hers so tightly she could feel the bones grinding together, and she welcomed the pain because it was the only thing that felt true in a world that had become nothing but shadows and silence. They had named her Hope because that was what she had been during those long months when Eleanor and Frederick had circled each other like wounded animals, because that was what Eleanor had clung to when Dr. Whitmore spoke of dangers and Frederick begged her to let the pregnancy end, because that was what had died in that nursery, along with a 4-hour-old girl who had never known anything but her father's arms and her mother's distant voice calling her name. The vicar spoke words that Eleanor did not hear, words about innocence and heaven and the mysterious workings of divine providence, and she wanted to scream at him that there was nothing mysterious about a child dying because she came too soon, nothing providential about a mother's empty arms and a father's shattered heart. Clara stood at the edge of the small gathering with her healthy children clinging to her skirts, and Eleanor could not bring herself to look at her sister's face because she knew she would see pity there, and pity was something she could not bear, not today, not ever. Lady Harriet had sent a card expressing formal condolences, but had not come herself, and Eleanor was grateful for that small mercy, because she did not think she could have endured the woman's presence without saying things that could never be unsaid. When the service ended, and the other mourners drifted away with their murmured sympathies and their sidelong glances, Eleanor and Frederick remained beside the grave as the sexton began to fill it with earth, and the sound of soil falling on wood was like a door closing on everything Eleanor had believed about herself, and her choices, and the meaning of sacrifice. She had chosen hope over Frederick's desperate plea, had insisted that the risk was worth taking, had believed that love and faith and sheer stubborn will could overcome the warnings that Dr. Whitmore had delivered with such careful gravity. And now hope was gone, and Frederick was broken, and Eleanor did not know how they would ever find their way back to each other across the vast distance that death had carved between them. But she knew with a certainty that surprised her that she would spend the rest of her life trying. The weeks that followed Hope's burial moved with a strange and terrible slowness, as though time itself had become thick and heavy with grief, and Eleanor found herself drifting through the days at Thornbury Hall like a ghost haunting rooms she no longer recognized as her own. Frederick had withdrawn into a silence so complete that it felt like a wall built brick by brick between them, and though he slept in the same bed and sat at the same table and walked the same corridors, he seemed to exist in a separate world where Eleanor could not reach him, no matter how desperately she tried. She understood his pain because it was her own pain, understood his guilt because she carried guilt of her own that whispered in the darkest hours that she had killed their daughter through stubbornness and pride, that if she had only listened to Frederick and Dr. Whitmore and everyone else who had warned her of the dangers, Hope might never have existed, but Eleanor would not have this hollow ache in her chest where her heart used to be. Mrs. Fairfax moved through the house with quiet efficiency, ensuring that meals appeared and fires were lit, and the household continued to function even as its master and mistress seemed to have forgotten how to live. And Eleanor was grateful for the older woman's steady presence, even when she could not find the words to express it. Clara came once with her healthy children in tow, and Eleanor had watched her sister's careful avoidance of any mention of the baby, had seen the relief in Clara's eyes that she had not been the one to suffer such a loss, had felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach that might have been anger or might have been simply the death of whatever sisterly affection had survived the years of condescension and dismissal. Her father wrote letters that Dr. Whitmore read aloud to him and helped him sign, letters full of love and sorrow and gentle encouragement that made Eleanor weep when she read them alone in the nursery that no one had yet found the courage to dismantle. She went there every day to sit in the rocking chair where Frederick had held their dying daughter, and she talked to Hope about the weather and the garden and the books she was not reading, talked to her about Frederick, and how much he had wanted her once she existed, even though he had been so afraid of losing Eleanor that he had begged her not to come into being at all. It was there that Frederick finally found her one evening in late April, the light failing outside the windows and the room growing cold because Eleanor had forgotten to ask for a fire, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before crossing the threshold and kneeling beside her chair and laying his head in, her lap like a supplicant seeking absolution. "I do not know how to live with this," he said, his voice muffled against her black skirts. "I do not know how to look at you without seeing her face." And Eleanor stroked his hair with fingers that trembled and told him that she did not know either, but that perhaps they could learn together. Perhaps they could find their way back to each other through the darkness if they were willing to try. The first day of May arrived with a warmth that felt like mockery, and Eleanor woke to find Frederick's side of the bed empty and cold, the sheets smooth as though he had never been there at all, and she lay still for a long moment, listening to the birdsong outside the window, and wondering if this was what the rest of her life would be, this endless reaching for someone who was always just beyond her grasp. She found him in the garden, standing before the roses that Mrs. Fairfax had coaxed back to life after the harsh winter, and his back was straight and rigid in a way that reminded her of the man she had first seen at the assembly all those months ago, the cold and distant Viscount who had looked at the world as though it held nothing worth wanting. Eleanor approached slowly, her slippers wet with morning dew, and when she reached his side, she did not speak but simply stood there, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, waiting for him to remember that she was still here, still alive, still his wife, even if their daughter was not. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and he said in a voice that cracked on the words that he had been thinking about what she had told him in the nursery, about learning together, about finding their way through the darkness, and he did not know if he was strong enough, but he wanted to try if she would let him. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of fear that had been tightening since the moment Hope drew her last breath, and she reached for his hand and held it the way he had held hers at the graveside, tightly enough to feel the bones beneath the skin, tightly enough to anchor them both to this moment and this place and each other. They walked through the garden together in silence, past the roses and the hedges and the stone bench where Eleanor had once sat alone, believing she would never know love. And when they reached the edge of the property where the wild meadow began, Frederick stopped and turned to face her with an expression she had not seen since before the ultimatum, before the terrible choice, before everything fell apart. "I blamed you," he said quietly, and the words hung in the air between them like a verdict. "I blamed you for choosing her over us, for refusing to listen, for being so stubborn that you would risk everything rather than bend. And I know that was unfair because I would have done the same thing in your place, because that stubbornness is one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But knowing something is unfair does not make the feeling go away." Eleanor listened without flinching, without defending herself, because she understood that he needed to say these things aloud before he could let them go. And when he finished speaking, she told him that she had blamed herself too, blamed herself every moment of every day since Hope's death, and perhaps they could learn to forgive together as well as grieve together. Perhaps forgiveness was just another word for love when love had been tested beyond endurance.